Near-death experiences are not all that uncommon. Floating out of your body, heading towards a bright white light, it's all been recounted before. Which is why what you're about to hear is so confounding. The man you are about to meet is a man of science, a brain surgeon centred in logic. Which is why his story of having died and gone to heaven is being seriously reported as proof the afterlife does exist. We'll let you be the judge. Here's PJ Madam.
You know, before this, I'd spent 20 years in academic neurosurgery. I thought I had a pretty good idea how the brain works and how it generates consciousness. I'd heard occasional near-death experience stories, and I was certain that there would be some brain explanation.
Eben Alexander is a Harvard-trained neurosurgeon. He put his faith in logic, in rational thought. Then, in 2008, he spent 7 days in a coma. Now, he's a believer.
As a neurosurgeon, has this experience changed your thinking about life?
It has totally changed everything about my thinking.
Most people have some idea of what happens when we die. If you do indeed believe in heaven, it usually involves white clouds, bright lights, mountain tops. Well, Dr. Alexander is a man of science and of medicine. Well, he says he's been to the other side and now he's back to tell us what it was really like. What you saw, or what you felt, is God. Is that your definition?
Yes.
Were you a man of faith before this?
Before my coma, I had no belief whatsoever in a personal loving God.
Adopted as a baby, Eben grew up in a conventionally Christian family.
If you had asked me before my coma, how much would a patient who was extremely sick and should have died from a severe case of bacterial meningitis, how much would they remember? I would have said nothing. They would not remember a single thing.
That all changed when this life-saving surgeon suddenly found himself facing his own mortality.
November 10, 2008. It didn't really start off as being very good, did it?
No, it was basically like being struck by a freight train. Woke up at 4:30 in the morning, had severe back pain, like nothing I'd ever felt before. It was a very severe meningitis, and the CT scans showed that it coated my entire brain. There wasn't any part of my neocortex that was left unscathed.
For 7 days, Dr. Alexander was in a coma. He was all but lifeless, completely unconscious. Yet he experienced a consciousness that defied all his years of medical training.
Here was this beautiful melody and this light spinning closer and closer. It opened up as a portal into this gorgeous realm that was verdant, waterfalls, colors indescribable, and millions of butterflies flying through, a very ultra-real scene. And then there was a warm breeze blowing through that was like the breath of divine.
In the hospital, his doctors were losing hope.
My physicians were telling my wife that basically she'd be raising our sons alone. My 10-year-old son, Bond, had heard that, realized it was very bad news, came running into my room, pried my eyes open, and, "Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay." As if he said it enough, it would make it true.
So your son was calling you back?
I had to come back. I had to claw my way up out of that very deep hole and somehow do whatever was necessary. He was pleading with me.
On the 7th day, against all odds, Dr. Alexander awoke. By medical standards, he made a miraculously quick recovery. But nagging the doctor was how to explain what he'd felt and seen.
This infinite blackness It was filled with love, and yet also filled with this light from this brilliant orb that was with me, and the divine, loving, infinitely powerful consciousness of the deity that created it all.
I mean, you realise how this sounds, though. It can come across as a bit crazy.
It does. Of course it does. When I was, had first gotten home from the hospital, I'd mentioned some of this to my doctors. They would go, "Oh, yes, you are very sick."
Many scientists say such an experience can't be real. Michael Shermer was once a born-again Christian. Today, he's America's most famous skeptic. So what do you think really happened? What's the scientific explanation behind his experience?
The scientific explanation behind Alexander's experience is nothing more than a near-death experience, an out-of-body experience, an altered state triggered by a stressful event.
Was it just a fantasy before death? Was it your brain basically telling you you're about to die, and it's a nice way of shutting down all the systems and making it a pleasant way to exit?
Well, it's very important to remember that I had a severe bacterial meningitis that had greatly damaged and destroyed my neocortex, the part of our brain that makes us human, the part that allows for any kind of conscious experience. So that with that amount of destruction, there was no way to have a dream, a hallucination, a fantasy, a confabulation. Those things could not occur because that part of my brain was gone.
It doesn't matter how rare the meningitis, none of that matters, because these things can be triggered by any number of conditions. We know, for example, that in a study of pilots accelerated in a centrifuge as part of their training, thousands of near-death and out-of-body experiences in pilots as they were passing out, as they're passing through that fuzzy borderlands between being consciously awake and being completely unconscious. They report as they are going under, passing through a tunnel, floating out of their body, the white light at the end of the tunnel. So there's certain common themes to these experiences that everybody has because our brains are all wired up through the same neurochemistry.
My rational scientific brain says it's all crazy. And then the other part of me says, look, I know it happened.
Eben Alexander's story is a familiar one for Carmel Bell. In 2009, while at home in Melbourne, she went into cardiac arrest.
The next thing I consciously know is that I looked down and saw me lying in bed on my back. I went, oh, that's me. I must be dead. I found myself in classically, I guess, what is known as heaven. There were stars, just the sky was full of stars. There were two other beings waiting to speak to me. One of these beings was 7 or 8 feet tall with these amazing eyes. That actually turned out to be the Archangel Metatron. And with him was a slightly smaller man who said that he was Jesus.
Who is Metatron?
He's meant to be the voice of God.
Well, even his name, Metatron, it sounds like something out of Transformer.
I know.
Megatron.
That's exactly what I think.
How did you know you'd met Jesus and this archangel? Did they say their names? Or
Yes, they did. They introduced themselves.
Okay, I've still got no pulse, mate.
Firemen and paramedics worked desperately to save Carmel. After 47 minutes, they were about to give up.
And all of a sudden, Scotty was doing a compression and the chest dropped on its own. And then the pigmentation of her skin changed. And we all looked at each other and go, wow, we've got a result.
Carmel came back to life but remained unconscious. Months later, once she had recovered, she met her rescuers, Steve, Scott and Gary.
Her first words were pointing at Gary and saying that she recognised him, and then pointing to Steve and saying, I know you, and then pointing to me and saying, I know you, but you had more hair. And at the time that we had the MR call with Carmel, I did have longer hair, and then cut it short. So, yeah, that was a surprise. Yeah, that threw us all back. We thought, wow.
I don't think it's crazy. Wouldn't it be nice when science can actually catch up? And, but Is it meant to be proved?
There are all kinds.
Attempting to prove it is the job of Dr. Sampania.
From a scientific perspective, we have to accept that these experiences occur. There are millions of cases out there, and it would be unscientific just to reject them.
Here at New York's Stony Brook Hospital, this medical scientist is collecting evidence that consciousness can live on once the brain dies.
Although the person is in fact dead and the brain doesn't function and the heart doesn't function, but the cells inside the brain are still in a potentially viable state. They're almost hibernating.
25 hospitals in Europe and the United States are participating in Dr. Pania's research.
After we die, based on the evidence that we have so far, that entity that makes me into who I am doesn't become annihilated. Does it continue tomorrow or the day after? I don't know. But certainly the first few hours after we die, during that phase when death is reversible, there is no evidence that it's annihilated. It's also important, though, to realize that the interpretation of the experience depends on a person's background. So, for instance, if a Hindu in India has a near-death experience and sees a being of light, then they will interpret that potentially as being Krishna or one of the Hindu deities. Whereas if somebody, say, in Australia who's a Christian, or in America who's a Christian, has an experience, they may perceive that they saw Jesus.
One of their tests of whether out-of-body experiences really happen is to place photos like this butterfly high above critically ill patients on the operating table.
And the idea is very simple. If we get a group of people who come back and claim to have seen us, we want to know whether they also see the images as well.
It was one vivid image seen by Dr. Alexander that finally convinced him that what he'd experienced was real.
There was a beautiful girl beside me on the butterfly wing. I can remember her face so perfectly, these sparkling blue eyes and light brown hair and this loving smile, and she never said a word, but her thoughts went right into me. You are loved, you are cherished dearly forever. There's nothing to fear. I knew her face so well, but I'd never met her in my life.
This is the woman Eben saw. Her name is Betsy. After Eben was adopted, his biological parents went on to have more children, including Betsy. She died in 1998. They never met, and it was only after his coma that the family sent him this photo.
And it was the very same girl who had been on the butterfly wing. And her face in the picture was almost mocking me, like, do you finally get it?
People want to believe. They want to think there's an afterlife, everything's going to be great, everybody loves you, all justice will be served, and everything will be made right in the end. I mean, who wouldn't want to believe that? I would like to believe, but what's more important for me is what's actually true.
I saw things I couldn't understand, couldn't explain, and I figured someday there would be a brain-based scientific explanation. Now I know there's a much easier, simpler, more straightforward explanation. That is that our soul is eternal, that our spirit lives forever.
And you can read more about Dr. Alexander's experience in his book, Proof of Heaven, which is out now.